want to thank our sponsors again. If you have feedback, bsides.com/feedback, or on the schedule for the talk, you can click on the feedback survey button. We have one final raffle at the end of the day. So it's a $150 Amazon gift card. So put your name, and the box will be provided by Jim Alto. Otherwise, this is James Addison from Lyft. He deals with fraud at Lyft, and he's going to be talking about fraud detection and real-time trust decisions.
Thank you. So, been to a few BSides events before. Glad to be sort of speaking for the first time here. I'd start by sort of introducing myself a little bit. I don't really have a security background as such, just a sort of keen interest. Like I go to a lot of security sort of conferences and things. I'm more of a general kind of software engineer, and my interests tend to be around kind of slightly arcane and unusual systems. So I worked in the travel industry for a few years, and I don't know if anyone here is familiar with airline GDS systems. They're the kind of weird booking systems that let you book seats on flights. Things like that, and kind of payment processing systems are kind of interest of mine. For some reason, I kind of find those slightly painful interfaces kind of interesting to work with. So my most recent experience has been at Lyft. I've been there a couple of years now. Mostly work on payments processing and a little bit of fraud detection. So I'm going to speak a little bit about kind of my experience in terms of kind of battling fraud. I'm going to speak a bit about how kind of fraudsters arrange their operations, a little bit of history behind that, you know, kind of looking back to kind of older kind of .com companies like 10 years ago. And I'm going to try and draw a few parallels for kind of discussion with, you know, fraud and traditional computer security and information security. So, my kind of thesis or kind of introduction for this talk would be that I see fraud as a type of attack. It's a financial exploit rather than, you know, necessarily getting access to information or data or services. But I think there are a lot of similarities between those two. Your business, whatever it is, you have some kind of attack service for fraud. You know, whether you're kind of processing transactions yourself, whether you're fulfilling orders for other people, there are ways to kind of target and attack that kind of operation. And essentially any way to render goods, render services without payment is going to be explored. Like it depends maybe at what scale you reach. You know, when you're going to find that, you might even not notice it until you really begin to have problems with kind of attacks. But these are the kind of things that people will look out for, and they will try to find kind of loopholes in your system. The other thing to note is this is again, it's a very adversarial type situation. So we have people like myself, the team I work with, we're trying to identify and kind of defend against these fraud attacks, using whatever signals we have, implementing new systems and practices to try to kind of close down any existing loopholes. And then, you know, it's again a bit like, you know, kind of breaking into systems. There's the other side of things, the kind of red team side of things, where you can analyze a system, kind of try and figure out where there might be gaps, where there might be weaknesses, and try to attack that. I'd also add, excuse me. I'd also add that these folks tend to be, I mean, there are various grades of sophistication, but some of the people out here are quite sophisticated. Like you should consider the possibility that they're even developing things like malware or kind of writing their own software to try and defeat your protections. So it's not just kind of sort of random people using stolen credit cards. It can be quite sophisticated, the types of attacks that these guys end up using. To that kind of end, this is an example of an attack that probably quite a few of you in the audience have heard about. So This is from a description of the Target credit card breach. So this happened a few years ago. And I like this diagram because it kind of illustrates that there's a whole kind of organizational pipeline that's going on here. It's not just a case of, some people broke into Target somehow and kind of stole all these credit cards and sold them as one single operation. There's a real process of sourcing cards from places, whether it's things like kind of skimming at ATMs, whether it's breaking into databases, actually getting full dumps of credit card numbers, often with personal information as well. Like there's a big thing around not just selling the card numbers, but also including personal information as well. And then there's quite a mature model where they'll go on and kind of test these cards, try and work out how much value is available on each of the credit cards, whether the cards are still valid, whether any of them have been reported as stolen. And then entire marketplaces where you can kind of go online. Some in the black market, some available via Tor, etc., but some where you can just kind of log on and kind of download, purchase stolen credit cards. And of course, then these finally go on to get used in purchases, often for high-value electronic goods, things which can then be kind of shipped on elsewhere and resold for real value. I think the example here includes just purchasing prepaid kind of gift cards, which are also a good way to ferry kind of value from stolen credit cards into real purchases. So this might be a touch difficult to read, unfortunately, but this is a graph of various different types of fraud, credit card fraud in particular. And this is reported by the UK Credit Card Association. So they do quite a good job of breaking down different types of credit card fraud. So these are things like card not present fraud, which is the vast majority of online transactions where the physical card holder and the card are not present, to things like replication or kind of creating kind of duplicate kind of credit cards. And a few other types of attack. The thing I would note here is the topmost line, which is kind of increasing and kind of heading up to the right. That is the card not present. So that's online kind of transaction fraud. So the interesting thing here is a lot of this postdates the introduction of chip and pin in the UK, sometimes also called EMV. So this is basically the chip that appears in your credit card and is used as an additional form of authentication during transactions. So, as you can see, that seems to be helping a fair bit with, physical kind of transactions where the card is available. Looks like they seem to be staying fairly steady. But what's really happened here is that kind of pressure against fraudsters has pushed that fraud into online, where it's a lot easier to simply use the credit card details. We are starting to see a few merchants introducing second factor authentication online. So you may have seen sometimes you get a prompt to enter your PIN code or some other bit of information on the web. That's going to start to help there. But for the moment, the fact that it literally is just kind of card number and a few other details, which are supposed to be somewhat difficult to obtain, but the reality is, if a credit card has been sourced from a database, there's a decent chance the other information is going to be there alongside. So, wanted to talk about a bit of the history, like how did we get to where we are just now? We now have the situation where the fraudsters have quite an evolved, kind of mature business pipeline. There are a lot of good pieces of advice out there about kind of how to, sort of best practices for how to avoid fraud on your own service. But what's the background? What are the things that led to where we are now? So, a lot of kind of historic attacks really relied quite heavily on the naivety of online merchants. So, think kind of late 1990s, still fairly kind of quite a new thing to be transacting with credit cards online. E-commerce wasn't a big deal. We maybe hadn't kind of seen many examples of failures or problems in the past. So There are some classic things like just not having very good security in your database, like not treating kind of credit card information as a kind of first-class piece of data. I think sort of zooming ahead to current day, if at all possible, I would say you really shouldn't be storing any credit card information if you can possibly avoid it. Like services like Stripe and Braintree do a great job of letting you pass on the job of tokenizing and storing all of that kind of sensitive data elsewhere. And that really doesn't limit the amount of stuff you can do as a service. You can still transact kind of huge amounts of value. You can still do any of the things that you'd be able to do by hooking up to a sort of fully fledged payment processor, but it reduces all of that risk, and that's a great way to go. Another example of sort of early naivety here would be services in which the fulfillment systems and the kind of card processing systems are disparate. So a user places an order, your fulfillment system kicks in, and within a few hours you've got some goods which are being shipped on a truck off to the other side of the country, and yet you haven't yet charged the credit card, so you don't actually even know if that's going to succeed or get declined. So again, seems like an easy thing, but that was a classic attack. Just kind of try all these cards on all kinds of merchants, see which ones you can actually use to get some goods out the other side. Another thing is, I think there are quite a few limitations with the verification systems that the card companies themselves expose. There are standards for these, like they provide documentation about AVS systems, and I forget what the A stands for, but it's sort of address verification. Thank you. So these will do things like check the zip code that your card's registered against, check that your name possibly matches against the card, although sort of haven't had much luck with that kind of functionality. They'll also check things like the street address that's registered for your card. This is good stuff. From reading a lot of the documentation about this, like it's not a super easy to use thing, and I think, maybe not blame, but there's an element of there's a hurdle to overcome in using those kind of things, which, again, I would say look at what APIs are available out there now, and I think you'll find that things are much easier nowadays. And then sort of final point there, I think also there was a lack of sort of reputation or trust assigned to accounts for a long time. So one of the things you really need to do is make sure that when you have user accounts, you're keeping track of how many sort of payment methods have been attributed to this account. Has the user successfully added a couple of credit cards? Have they failed to add 10 different credit cards? Like that would be a big red flag there. And I think in the early days, people maybe didn't do a great job of storing that kind of account trust and attribution. So that's great. Let's say we do start having these accounts where we've got more verified information about the user. We're not going to ship our goods until we know that everything's okay with the payment. There are still sort of potential loopholes. So classic attack, which we've seen sort of people attempt as well, is you'll create a good account. You'll fill that with kind of the best verified information that you have available. Try and get that account into a good state where it's trusted by the system. And at that point, you do a sort of switch up. Like at that point, you'll start to use some of the sort of stolen or otherwise acquired like credit cards. Maybe use other kind of payment mechanisms to try and use that account to get some service. So something I'd recommend there is basically, you have to treat any attempt to add new payment information or any action with that account. You have to be quite careful to run maybe some of the same amount of checks. Certainly, if for new payment instruments, you want to run all of those same kind of verifications, and you generally should consider kind of degrading the value of signals over time. So if an account has been dormant for a long time, then you might want to be a little bit more kind of skeptical of the state of that account. To go into a little bit more detail about what happens to these goods that people are trying to acquire. So obviously this doesn't apply to all businesses. Many businesses provide kind of online services. Transportation could be an example of that. But if you are shipping kind of physical goods, one classic thing to watch out for is reshipping. So I have a bit of a story from PayPal, from a colleague of mine. He was on the kind of fraud team at PayPal when it was first developing. And I think they're a really good source of a lot of early stories for kind of fraud detection in the early days of online payments. So what they identified, they don't always require kind of delivery addresses on their accounts, but what they did start to discover from the address information they did have is very big clusters of kind of fraudulent addresses, things where a lot of transactions would be charged back, so the user would, claim that the goods weren't delivered, or basically sort of result in other kind of failed transactions. And what they had identified is basically services called reshipping services. A lot of these are legitimate, but they will receive goods on your behalf and then forward those to other addresses. Some of them will do kind of international forwarding as well. And so it can be pretty tricky, particularly with PayPal now, to use things like freight forwarders. So this is an example of how they took a signal from the real world. They found something that allowed them to kind of clamp down on these transactions. And of course I recognize, there are times when that is legitimate business, so it's not a perfect solution. But for them and for their bottom line, that helped them kind of trim down on fraud a lot. I think there are one or two cities in particular, sort of around the US, which they're now, it's very difficult to transact on PayPal if your kind of delivery destination is one of those cities, just because of rules like this. It's also interesting to see how attacks have evolved as a result of this. So the example which is actually highlighted up here is in relation to human mules for reshipping. So if you know that you're not going to be able to get goods to all of these sort of zip addresses or locations, what's a possible kind of workaround you can use? So in a couple of fraud attacks, what people have started doing is actually recruiting kind of mules. So these are people, just with everyday street addresses who will receive those goods, and then it'll be up to them to actually kind of either physically take those goods or kind of mail them themselves to some other destination. So it's basically a way to kind of work around those kind of address limitations. There's a pretty good story. Air Parcel Express is the name of one company. There's a fairly good report by RSA, in fact, which has like a good story of like an example of this taking place. So if we do want to have kind of flexible delivery options, so let's say we're a company like Amazon, which also of course transacts huge amounts. We do want to enable things like same-day delivery. We want to have multiple addresses per account. What kind of things can we do to deal with this and also scale this out? Like we need to be able to perform kind of millions of transactions per day. How can we deal with this kind of stuff? And what they and sort of many others do is they build kind of trust models. So take all of those accounts your users have. Again, ensure you can do as much upfront as possible to verify information about the billing address, information about those cards. Other user activity as well is valid, like how did the user sign up for an account? Do they tend to use kind of lots of discounts? Is there anything abnormal about the way that they use the site or the service? Do they tend to deliver to one address, one or two addresses? Basically any kind of signals that you and your team could kind of come up with which might help kind of determine different types of behavior. Collect all those and then kind of build trust models. So starting to look a little bit towards kind of machine learning and things which will scale more than any kind of human-defined rules possibly could for identifying issues. One other thing I'd add there as well is I haven't talked a great deal about chargebacks, but chargebacks will be reported to you by your payment processor or whichever service you use. And it's very much worth including kind of data about chargebacks into these models. They're very expensive to you as a merchant. Like if someone charges back on a credit card transaction made to them, not only will you not get the revenue for the transaction which occurred in the first place, but also you often have to pay an additional fine on top of that. And this is a common technique that people will use to try to pay for something and then sort of recoup those funds and get the value back on the card. So we're now in a world where we've got a lot of kind of on-demand and more like real-time services out there. So let's just kind of take a moment and think about what is really kind of different here. You know, what has actually changed about this situation. So a lot is still the same. The way that we pay for things hasn't been modified a great deal. What has really changed is that time duration between. It could even be someone signs up, installs an app, and then uses that for some kind of service straight away. So that time window can be very short. So that's something to consider. We also have much higher expectations on the behalf of the user. So people expect to receive that service right away. They tend not to like friction. So the fewer details you are required to add, you know, in order to activate the service, the better. And in some sense, you know, there is better information available in terms of a little bit more identity. Like you can argue that we're now using sort of mobile devices which have some level of identity attached. I think that's countered by the fact, you know, as we're all aware, you can kind of clear identity on devices. You can use virtual devices. You can spoof locations. So we need to be a little bit cautious about sort of what we do there. But it's certainly true that in some sense we might have more kind of identifying information. But the big risk, of course, is that we have a lower kind of decision time with which we can either approve or deny a user a given service. So given these assumptions, so we can assume that fraudsters are resource bound. So if they want to do kind of more sophisticated attacks, they are going to need kind of fake numbers that they can use, potentially even fake devices. Depends how effective like virtual devices are for them. They may need email addresses depending on the service the verification steps you're using. And there may be other things, other barriers that you can kind of put up to increase the cost of fraud. The other thing that we definitely know, which is very good, is we definitely know what our exposure is from various transactions. So if you're shipping some goods, electronics goods for a couple of $100 worth, you know what the potential cost to you is if you kind of lose that shipment, if that disappears. So we can use that to balance the cost that we're applying to the fraudster, you know, how difficult are we making it for them to set up an account versus what are the risks to us, and that's a very useful trade-off to be able to make. And we can assume that it is somewhat difficult to kind of clear device identity. It's certainly not impossible, and again, depending on how sophisticated the groups that are attacking you are, you may see kind of various levels of that, but for a lot of kind of fairly ground level fraud, it is true that you will see kind of repeat devices getting reused. And also, as with the kind of goods examples previously, in many cases you can still just charge upfront. You know, if a user is making a reservation for something a few days ahead, then you can go ahead and run that transaction now. And then you're not taking on any of that risk, so that still applies in a lot of cases. So something that I've seen that's been sort of very, very effective in terms of combating and detecting fraud is to build relationship graphs. So graph databases are perfect for this. What we really care about in this situation is we care about the relationships of the various entities in our service. So I would include things like credit cards. I would include user accounts. I would include user locations, billing locations, all of that stuff in there. Get all of that stuff into some kind of graph network, and that'll start letting us draw kind of connections between users. We'll start to see, has this credit card been shared between 5, 10, 100 users? Things like that can be a very, very strong signal. Again, you can see maybe a huge spike in 100 or so accounts getting created in the same location. Sort of clustering, things like that are also sort of worth looking out for. And then what we can start to do is we can start to record reputation against the nodes in that graph. So I'd hinted a little bit, a few times there about having reputation per account. This is a perfect kind of place to store that information. So most of the graph databases I know about will let you store kind of plenty of attributes against each node. And so you might have an account, the number of transactions they'd made in the past, the number of failures, perhaps the value of the transactions that customer has made. That could be useful information. But then we're getting on to, what's the challenge after that? Like, let's say we've got all this information. What's that actually going to be good for? So this is when we need to start bringing in machine learning. So there are kind of basic rules we could extrapolate once we've got this graph, but we want to avoid encoding too much of our own sort of human business logic in this. Like, it's better if we can just feed in all of those signals and have the system tell us, like, what its decision would be. Like, should we let this user continue? And I'd add that we have the perfect labeled data set for that. Like, your business has run plenty of transactions. You've seen the ones that have failed. You've seen the ones that have been approved. So you actually know from your own data set, what are the classifications, what are the labels for the results of that kind of training. So use that graph, use those accounts as input, and train with the historic results as labels. The other thing to do is, like, make sure to shadow these models. You want to be very careful about anything that's going to affect your production service, of course. So before introducing one of these models into production, you should make sure to kind of shadow those results offline. So keep records, keep very good sort of analytics about what decisions would have been made, but determine after the fact whether those were effective, or, how correct were those. Would there have been negative impact to good users, like false positives are definitely something to watch out for. And, this might sound a little bit heavyweight, but you should be able to get, for any kind of action that a user is taking, like maybe they're about to make some kind of purchase, you should really be able to retrieve any of the relevant information from your graph database and run maybe a few models in sort of sub-couple hundred milliseconds. Like, this shouldn't be expensive stuff. This should be the kind of thing you can do without the user necessarily even realizing there's been any kind of checks taking place. And that compares pretty favorably, I think, to sort of more heavyweight operations, like actually talking to the bank network to perform any card checks. So a few kind of lessons learned from sort of seeing some of this stuff. It definitely requires quite a big internal engineering investment. Like, this stuff is quite application specific. You need to know what signals you're going to extract, what kind of stuff you're going to store in your reputation network, and that's not really something that can be sold kind of as a off-the-shelf kind of product. Some vendors may claim otherwise. I would be skeptical of those claims, but it's always worth kind of seeing what's out there. Certainly try to use kind of ground truth signals where you can. Like I talked about kind of previously declined transactions and chargebacks. Like, those are things that happened in the real world that you know from your own data. They're the perfect kind of things to train against. I've sort of heard of stories where people have tried to use kind of other feedback from the system, or maybe use previous decisions of models to relearn against. I tend to think that kind of stuff is a bit risky. Like, you risk getting into things like feedback loops when you're training. Another thing is consider deteriorating the signals from older data. So, if a user hasn't used an account in a long time, again, you maybe don't want to apply the same level of trust that you once had for that account kind of 6, 12 months ago. And very much use external signals as well where available. So there's one really useful feature that most credit card tokenizers, so Stripe, Braintree as examples again, they can provide a sort of a fingerprint, like a hash of all of the card details, and you can use that in a non-identifying way to link appearances of the same card across multiple usages. So that's a great example of something that's the perfect thing to use as the edges between the nodes in your graph. That's a very, very powerful kind of signal. And a few more kind of useful tips. So there are existing kind of graph databases out there. So Neo4j is a very popular JVM-based one. There's something I haven't really looked into yet called Gaffer, which is from GCHQ. And that seems to have a lot of these kind of properties, these same kind of mechanisms built in. So that might be something worth looking at if you're thinking of building something like this from scratch. I've had great experience with scikit-learn in terms of training and kind of deploying models. There are more sophisticated things you can do there, I'm sure. And I think there are even a few sort of cloud and hosted based kind of machine learning tools becoming available. Those might also be worth looking into depending on your level of kind of sensitivity about personal information. Certainly, yep, sort of be aggressive about performance goals. You should consider these kind of checks to be negligible in terms of latency cost. You should be able to run these things frequently. You should kind of use the scores that you get back from them and use those to weight against the cost to your business for various actions. And also another maybe non-obvious note, do build for a world where you have different types of decisions that you want to make. So to give a sort of concrete example, sometimes it can be useful before kind of making a transaction to perform an authorization on a credit card, just to check that it has the right amount of value available. Or sometimes you might just want to go ahead and sort of charge straight away. That's maybe a good example of the kind of thing you'd want to do here. If you have a reason to suspect this person might be fraudulent, maybe you'd want to perform that check ahead of time. And I'd also add, I've got a few resources which are in the slide deck and will be posted for a few kind of articles which all relate to building these kind of fraud detection systems. So definitely refer, kind of see what's out there. There are people who have been building these kind of things as well, and there are lots of resources out there. So, sort of towards the closing of this, I just want to think about some of the parallels with security. So this is all sort of very much for discussion. Again, I don't have much of a security background myself. I've heard a few people comment that this is kind of similar to what SIM systems are supposed to do, sort of like them or loathe them. It's certainly possible for these fraud detection systems to involve a human feedback element. That's something I've seen used a little bit. So, especially to avoid false positives, if you're in any doubt, maybe we should alert someone, use a human operator to kind of intermediate there. I think that's more similar to SIM, maybe where you'd have kind of alerts that are raised. I think maybe one of the key differences is all the stuff I've talked about there is very application specific. Whereas I think these vendors are trying to sell things where you just plug it into your network, into your access logs, and it just kind of magically provides you what we need. And another sort of thought is, would any of these kind of approaches work for other kind of privileged access decisions? If you were trying to decide whether to allow a user to log into a certain resource, would these kind of fuzzy metrics ever be useful? That's, again, something I'd be interested in chatting to people about. And one thing which I don't have so much experience with, but have definitely sort of seen in the past as well, is some more sophisticated attackers will sort of actually stage their operations. You know, it won't just be a case of sign up for an account and make some transactions. There'll actually be clusters of accounts that are created ahead of time. Sometimes we're able to detect those, again, using account linkages, but sometimes they're prepared quite well and quite carefully. And then they may sit idle for a long time. And I don't know sort of any great ways off the top of my head to kind of automatically detect or kind of look out for that kind of stuff. I guess you could use things like inactive accounts. We certainly try to kind of reactivate accounts and kind of keep people interested, but I'd also be very keen to hear from anyone who has ideas about kind of protecting it against those kind of network attacks. So I think that's about all I had. I think we should have a little bit of time for questions.
I do some work for a nonprofit which had its fundraising campaign at the end of November, December, as many do. And one of the things we discovered is that the card vendors were using us as an oracle to figure out if their cards were still alive. They were making very small numbers of, $1 or $5 charges. And of course, these would all be charged back or we would decline them. But we finally figured out that our objective was to give them as little feedback as possible so they couldn't use us as an oracle. But the other funny thing we noticed is that there were some people who were Robin Hooding, and they were giving us thousands of dollars on other people's debit cards. And we still don't understand why they were doing that, because we could think of no way that they can convert that to their benefit. So I wonder if you happen to have seen that in any context, people doing very large transactions on debit cards just to figure out what its value is, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, that term oracle there is a very good one to know. So basically this is a good example of kind of people testing credit cards, trying to figure out, how much value is on there. Yes, we have seen that kind of stuff. And yes, the kind of best practice advice there is be very reserved about kind of what you actually indicate to the user about why you didn't accept the transaction. Like you don't want to hint, that there's something wrong with the card. Like maybe you might even know it's stolen. I think some of the kind of responses that credit card processors will give you will tell you why the card was declined. But generally, it's good practice not to expose that to the users. Regarding the second point about have I seen kind of Robin Hood-esque use of credit cards? So, I mean, the main point of reference I have is Lyft, and I would maybe leave it to your imagination, but there are reasons why people would want to use transport, to get from A to B on stolen credit cards. So for us, there's a pretty clear kind of value proposition. Why they would donate using stolen credit cards, that is very interesting. I don't have any answers, but maybe someone in the audience would.
I have a question here. So I have a friend who shall remain unnamed. It's more, for the lack of a better word, called friendly fraud. So, Lyft used to provide referral bonuses. I'm not a big user of Lyft, so I don't know the details. And so did Uber. So he would actually refer himself. Email IDs are free. Google Voice numbers are free. And his credit card provider had virtual account numbers where he could generate virtual account numbers. So he pretty much didn't pay for any of his Lyft rides for like 6 months. Do you have any lessons learned from that type of an attack?
Yeah. So I didn't really mention that, but I mean, we and Uber and many other kind of companies make a lot of use of coupons to kind of incentivize users. We really like to think of those. We like to think of them, in essence, in many ways, the same as credit cards. Like they're just a source of funds. It so happens that we've issued them to you ourselves, but we certainly don't want to issue too many of them. Like we really want to grant them. We're granting credit to you in the hope that you're going to use our service. So I would actually say that like coupons were one of the first applications of a lot of the type of technology we were using here. Like just detecting has someone kind of logged in, from the same device multiple times, are we going to kind of grant them coupons for that new device? So I hope that answers your question. I mean, basically, we are very concerned about that kind of stuff, and this is also an application of the type of stuff that we do to defend against it. So the question was, is that the only form of protection we have against that? It's not. Like, we have, trying to think, I mean, we have limitations on the number of coupons we'll issue. We often have geographic restrictions and other things to make sure that kind of use isn't ballooning. And we have a lot of sort of monitoring and alerting on that kind of stuff as well. At the end of the day, most of it does come down to kind of detecting the same person again. I mean, there's not ultimately a huge amount more we can do than that, but we do have, there are various checks that we have to try and make sure it's not being abused on a regular basis.
I have two questions. The first one should have a fast answer. The second one is maybe a bit longer. I work for it's kind of an on-demand marketplace company, and two-sided marketplace. And we're facing a lot of issues with fraud right now. The fast question is there an industry standard for how much customers are willing to get pre-authorized charged? My boss told me that if you charge them more than $1, people freak out and there's a huge drop-off. But that would solve a large number of issues that we have. And the second question is, you mentioned using kind of more complex graph-based solutions to tackle fraud. But what about using something like SignalFX, where it's based on collectee, and you just kind of, raise an alert if you have, more cards created than, above one standard deviation than what's usual for the same user?
Yep, cool. So yeah, regarding authorization amounts, like what are some industry standards for that kind of stuff? So there's a really nice thing you can do with what are called $0 card authorizations. So this is basically just a ping that kind of it does hit the person's kind of the linked bank for the card. So it is going to verify that the card is valid and exists, but it's not actually going to check anything about the balance. Like, it's not going to hold any funds. So that can be extremely useful. Like, I definitely kind of look into that kind of stuff. $1 is also a kind of implicit standard. PayPal does this interesting thing where if you authorize for $1, they don't send an email to notify the person, which is kind of unusual, but I think is a sort of implicit understanding that, this is a temporary authorization. There are also things you can do to change the statement text for these auths, which is worth doing. Once you get into higher kind of values, I think it's less clear. Like, I don't really know of any standards there. And then to answer your second question, yes, I would say, like, graph databases, they're not necessarily complicated. I think where things start to get a bit tricky is once you've got the machine learning as well, then you usually need some kind of somewhat expert engineering knowledge. There is definitely a lot you can do without having to invest in any of this stuff. Like, so yeah, things like you suggest, just having thresholds, even just using traditional databases, like have an index on a column which is the device ID for a user, and kind of look for kind of too many people using that device. Those are much lower cost ways, and that's a good way to get started, and then you can kind of roll into more mature stuff when you need it.
Hi, back here. Hi there. Very good session. Thank you very much. One question I had is, back here. Have you been able, most of the information seems to be more about the transactions themselves. Have you been able to tie any of this, or have you looked into like clickstream analytics, like how fast someone's moving through the site and registering and stuff like that?
Yeah, great question. So yes, a lot of it depends on the level of instrumentation you're willing to go into, but it's actually, I should apologize if too much of that seemed to be about the transactions. Like, there are a lot of other user signals. I think Twitter had a lot of success actually with their anti-spam team of just determining how quickly people are kind of typing into the various login fields. So yes, don't just look at the financial stuff. use any signal you think would differentiate a real user from a fraudulent user.
Hey, I was going to say in response to the person who was talking about large donations, we have the exact same problem, and my understanding is that in some cases it actually is like a Robin Hood motivation. Like, we had people from like Anonymous donating stuff to us, and they were like, "You guys are cool. Here's some free money," and it was just a chargeback in the end. Right, yeah, we're Freedom of the Press Foundation. But so the other problem the other thing I've heard is that a lot of that is actually people testing high value or high limit credit cards and proving that they can get the high limit or the high value out of it. So it's probably that.
One here? Yep. Yeah, so the question there was how to learn more about the economics of reshipping. So I have a couple of links in the slides there was that one article in an RSA publication about that reshipping slide. I think that'd be a good place to start. I actually haven't done a huge amount of research into that, but I'm sure that would lead you places.
Cool. Well, thank you again. Appreciate it. And again, on behalf of BSides, and thanks to our sponsor Fitbit, here is a Fitbit. And we also have a special announcement as well.
Hey, so everybody who's worried about that burning smell, it's cool. I've had like 6 people be like, is it okay? Do we have to evac? No, it's at 9th and Harrison, something's on fire, which if you're not from here is like 7 blocks away. So we just happen to be downwind. We're fine. And EMS is all over it. So don't worry about it. And please stop asking me if you need to evac. If you need to evac, we'll tell you.